Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, the Prime Minister returns to the White House.
It's a complicated agreement, more complicated maybe than any other agreement we have.
And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective.
Mark Carney and Donald Trump share some kind words but emerge without a trade deal. We have full coverage from Washington, plus reaction from former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and from former Canadian diplomat Colin Robertson. Also,
I'm really worried that we're going to have in the future the same 10 bad years that we had over the last 10 bad years because of the federal Liberal policies.
The current Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, on pipelines, tension with BC, and her talks with the Prime Minister. This is PrimeTime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson with you. We start with Mark Carney's second trip to the White House as Prime Minister. He and President Donald Trump praising each other and the Canada-U.S. relationship. However, the pair not announcing an agreement on tariffs and trade. For more, let's go to Michael Serapio in Washington. And so, Michael, no concrete deal was reached at this meeting. What was actually accomplished today?
Well, you know, if you were to choose a word that the Canadian government wanted to send, or a feeling that the Canadian government wanted to send with this trip, Andrew, it is the word of reassurance. Reassurance that talks between our two countries are moving in the right direction. Reassurance that Mark Carney enjoys a certain relationship with the American president. And you know, I take it that that may rub some Canadians the wrong way. But we know from everyone that has worked with Donald Trump, he is more apt to make mutually beneficial deals with people he likes than people he does not like. And you know, on that front, the president was very complimentary to the Prime Minister, calling him a tough negotiator, but clearly respecting Mark Carney. Take a listen to what Donald Trump had to say about the Prime Minister today.
He's a world-class leader. He's a man that knows what he wants, and I'm not surprised to see that he won the election and won it substantially, and I would think he's more popular now. He's a good man. He does a great job, and he's a tough negotiator.
So if he's a great man and you want to do a deal with Canada, why aren't you?
Because I want to be a great man, too.
So clearly, there is this level of admiration for Mark Carney, but still there is, as you said, Andrew, no concrete deal. And remember, back in May, after the first White House visit, Canadian officials were raising the possibility of striking some form of deal within 30 days, but then 2 deadlines passed with nothing happening. And that has opened the Prime Minister up to criticism, most recently from the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. That open letter that he wrote just a couple of days ago in which, you know, Pierre Poilievre said Mark Carney is a disappointment in the trade file. So I asked the U.S. president, you know, given these complimentary words he was sharing about Mark Carney, I asked him from his vantage point then, what is holding up a deal? Take a listen to how Donald Trump answered my question.
Well, it's a complicated agreement, more complicated maybe than any other agreement we have on trade, because, you know, we have natural conflict. We also have mutual love. You know, we have great love for each other. I love this. I love Canada and the people of Canada, and Mark feels the same way about here. The problem we have is that they want a car company and I want a car company, meaning the U.S. wants a car company, and they want steel and we want steel. And, you know, so in other countries they're very far away, and there's no problem. You can compete and you can do. We don't like to compete because we sort of hurt each other when we compete, and so we have a natural conflict. It's a natural business conflict. Nothing wrong with it. And I think we've come a long way over the last few months, actually, in terms of that relationship.
So a natural competition, he says, but he is also, I should say, predicting that there will be a deal that Canadians will be happy with. The Prime Minister also playing up the fact that Canadian investments in the United States amounted to about $500 billion in the last year alone. There's also the potential of another $1 trillion within 5 years, says Mark Carney. That is, if the two sides can get to a deal that the Prime Minister has in his mind, Andrew.
So positive words shared by the two, but Mr. Trump did continue to muse about making Canada a part of the United States. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, you're right, Andrew. That did happen. It was while the Prime Minister was actually praising the President for being transformative on the world stage. Take a listen to how this 51st state conversation went down today.
You are a transformative president, and since then, the transformation in the economy, unprecedented commitments of NATO partners to defense spending, peace from India, Pakistan through to Azerbaijan, Armenia, disabling Iran as a force of terror, and now, and I'm running out of time, but this is in many respects the most important.
The merger of Canada and the United States.
That wasn't where I was going.
So a jovial reference, far less serious than the tone that we heard last week when the U.S. president talked about annexing Canada before military leaders. But again, today was all about trade, less about the 51st state conversation, but about the U.S.-Canadian trade relation. And with that, we did also hear from the Minister for Canada-U.S. Trade. He called today's talks successful, positive, and substantial. And while no formal deal was reached today, Dominic LeBlanc says he does hope that deals on steel, aluminum, and energy will be reached in short order. Those deals serving essentially as a first step for other deals that Dominic LeBlanc hopes will follow. And you know, to close out what I was saying earlier, Andrew, for the government today was about sending out a message of reassurance, whether or not Canadians feel reassured from what was gathered in this trip to Washington. We're going to have to see in the days to come, although we should note that those who are familiar with this visit say that Mark Carney is having dinner this evening with the U.S. Vice President for a working dinner. So we'll see where things go. Back to you.
All right, Michael, thank you for that. That is Michael Serapio in Washington. You heard Michael mention what the Prime Minister said about Canadian foreign investment in the U.S., that there could be another $1 trillion over 5 years if the countries reach a new trade agreement. That message from Mark Carney leading to this from the official opposition leader in the House.
Today, the Prime Minister promised the President that Canadian government policies would drive $1 trillion out of our economy into the American economy over the next 5 years. That is twice as bad as has happened in the last half-decade. This means lost jobs and lower wages for Canadians who already can't pay their bills. Again, why did the Prime Minister sell out Canadian workers in his visit to Washington?
You know what Canadians feel when they see the Prime Minister and ministers in the Oval Office defending Canada? Mr. Speaker, they feel pride. They feel pride that this Prime Minister is standing up for our country, standing up for our workers, standing up for our steel industry, and these crazy hair-eyed schemes that the Leader of the Opposition comes up with just to get in the news cycle are quite frankly a little embarrassing.
And for more on today's White House meeting, let's welcome Jason Kenney, a former Premier of Alberta and a former federal Conservative minister. Good to see you, Mr. Kenney.
Good to be here.
Now, we heard Conservatives in the House today repeatedly accuse the Prime Minister of failing when it comes to the Canada-U.S. relationship and dealing with the Trump administration. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what we've been seeing unfold in Washington?
Well, I don't think it's unfair given the Prime Minister's own commitments and standards. He said he was going to have a comprehensive deal with the United States within 90 days, and so far we have nothing. But Canada has given up on various tariffs. Canada's given President Trump what he demanded in terms of its defense expenditures, repealing the digital services tax. So it has been, on the Canadian side, all give, on the U.S. side, all take. That's not exactly the elbows up, aggressive, assertive approach that the Prime Minister ran on. Now, maybe he's come to conclude that that approach simply wasn't going to work at the present. But I think he should be forthcoming with Canadians about that.
We did hear Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc say this afternoon that the talks were more detailed than before, that the leaders want the conversation to continue, and he was using terms like successful and positive and substantial progress and momentum. What do you think Canadians should take from that?
Well, look, I like Minister LeBlanc very much, and I think he's a capable minister, but he's also a pretty good rhetorician. He's a good spinner, let's put it that way. And he, I don't see any progress. I don't see any momentum. But what I see is just a series of meetings of ministers treating the White House and those around it like it's some kind of an imperial court, going down to Washington every other week and having more meetings and agreeing to have more meetings. But we still have these crippling tariffs on Canadian lumber, on Canadian aluminum and Canadian steel, on auto parts and many other sectors of our economy. We have this huge threat to NAFTA, and we continue to have a president who, quote unquote, jokes about taking over Canadian sovereignty. So if that's how they define progress, I'd hate to see failing.
I do want to ask you, though, about those meetings and the impact of those meetings, because you know full well, given your political experience, the amount of meetings that can go back and forth between two governments. We've heard Pierre Poilievre as well criticize the stalled progress on a deal, talking about those working lunches between Canadian and American officials. Are these meetings important? You seem to be suggesting that perhaps they're not accomplishing what they're supposed to be.
Well, so far they're not accomplishing anything tangible. But I mean, I grant that there's no simple solution for Canada in this context, that we are dealing with a president who I don't think really has a coherent strategy on this, but rather it's improvisation. We do know that one of the things driving the president is his, I think, wrong-headed belief that these tariffs are going to result in a kind of reindustrialization of the American economy. And really all it's going to do is continue to add costs for American consumers. One of the things we can see in public opinion polling is that the president's approval rating around economic management, inflation, the cost of living has been on a pretty precipitous decline. He used to be in the high 50s on those issues in the first 2 or 3 months of his presidency, and he's now in the low 40s or the high 30s. So he's lost substantial support from Americans on those critical ballot box, kitchen table issues. And I think if this carries on into next year, if his tariffs that are, for example, MAGA voters drive F-150s, the cost of which is going to go up by about $7,000 US because of the tariffs on Canadian aluminum. They're built with aluminum chassis. When that hits MAGA voters, you're going to see more and more frustration. And if that carries into 2026, the midterm election year, I hope that the president will begin to reconsider the inflationary consequences of his protectionist policies. I think that's going to have a bigger impact on President Trump's policy direction than any number of meetings by Canadian officials.
Okay, and I want to finish now by asking you about Canadian public opinion, because we had the president today calling Mark Carney a world-class leader, a tough negotiator, saying he's not surprised that the Liberal leader won the last election. Do you think those words from Donald Trump help or hurt the Prime Minister here at home?
I can't imagine that they're going to turn into a Liberal election act, that's for sure. But it's not entirely new. We can recall the president effectively endorsed Prime Minister Carney in the last election, said he was his preferred choice for Prime Minister. So this is something that the Prime Minister is going to have to explain to Canadians. How has he won this tremendous admiration from the American president who has done more to attack Canada's economy than any in our modern history?
All right, Jason Kenney, really appreciate you making time for us tonight. Take care.
Thank you.
To continue the conversation, let's bring in Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat who is currently a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Colin, good to see you.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
So we have Minister Dominic LeBlanc saying that he's more optimistic than when he arrived in Washington. We have the president suggesting that Canada would walk away very happy today. Should Canadians feel happy?
Well, it could have ended much worse. Just remember President Zelensky in the Oval Office, or the President of South Africa. I think it went as well as we could have hoped, and I don't think there was much expectation that we were going to come out of this with any kind of a deal. What we did get was the President's full attention on the issue for over an hour, and he said very positive things about the Canada-U.S. relationship and about Prime Minister Carney, and so that should act as help our negotiators, Dominic LeBlanc and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, in their continuing negotiations, which, as Dominic LeBlanc said, will continue likely tomorrow.
Yeah, and we heard the president speak of natural conflict in the negotiations when it comes to the auto sector with the steel sector. He says the two countries are competing for the same business. What does that suggest to you when it comes to how that tariff discussion is now going to unfold?
It suggests to me that we're likely to wind up with not a freer trade agreement, but a managed trade agreement, similar to what we already have with lumber and with the auto industry, but we may see this go into other industries, perhaps steel and aluminum as well, if we're able to reach an agreement.
And I also thought it was illuminating when we heard the president talk about the difficulty of reaching a deal with Canada compared to the European Union, for instance. You know, ultimately, what do you think is holding up an agreement? Is it the simple fact that our two countries are so interconnected?
Yes, Andrew, I think that's it. It's the most complex, as both the president and the prime minister articulated, relationship in the world. It's in the auto industry is probably the prime example of that. It's been deeply integrated for over 60 years, as the prime minister said, as long as he's been alive. And trying to separate that, the car companies don't want it, the labor unions don't want it, the parts manufacturers don't want it, but the president and his team are insistent on it, and it is happening. And the result, of course, is more unemployment in Canada, disruption in the industry, and higher prices for consumers.
Okay, and we also heard the president again talk about supply management, about market access for American farmers as an irritant, but we've also heard Canadian leaders continue to say that supply management is not on the table. Going forward, do you think that system is at risk in order to get a deal for these other sectors like steel, like autos, like lumber?
Yeah, no, Andrew, I do not think it will be at risk. I think what we'll do is we'll offer the Americans perhaps more quota, but keep our supply management system. The Americans have supply management system for things like rice and sugar, and I think tobacco. So we can do the same. The agriculture industry in both countries is heavily supported by governments. This is common around the world. Even though they're extraordinarily successful, we are an agri-food power, as is the United States. So I don't think that will be an issue at the end of the day. I think we'll be able to keep supply management. We may give the Americans a bit more quota, which they're not using currently, but we will sustain the system that we have because all parties in Canada are absolutely committed to it, and it would be too big a political risk. And I think the Americans understand that.
Okay, let's finish on this then, because as a former diplomat, you were involved in free trade negotiations with the United States. I want to ask what you're going to be watching for next in these talks, and really as we keep inching toward this fuller review of the CUSMA agreement next year.
I think the negotiations are going to continue for some time because it is so complex, but I'm going to be watching to ensure that they do continue. Be watching to see whether Ambassador Hillman stays on. She's our chief negotiator, but she's been there a long time. Whether Dominic LeBlanc remains in place. I think this could go on for months. And as you say, it is bound up with the Canada-U.S. Mexico agreement, but the Americans have already indicated that they would prefer to do bilateral deals with Canada and Mexico. That would disrupt the productive capacity we've already arrived at, this North American platform, but that may be where we wind up. And in many ways, the negotiations, when we do sit down on continentally, are really what we used to call dueling bilaterals. That is Canada-U.S., U.S.-Mexico, Canada-Mexico, and Mexico-U.S.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Colin Robertson, thanks as always for your insight on the Canada-U.S. relationship.
My pleasure, Andrew.
The Alberta Premier is continuing her trip through Eastern Canada one day after meeting the Prime Minister. Danielle Smith says she's in Quebec and Ontario this week to build relationships. But Alberta's relationship with BC continues to flare up over pipelines. And with me now in studio is Premier Danielle Smith. Premier, welcome.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I do want to start with your relationship with Prime Minister Mark Carney. We are just over 24 hours after your meeting with him. What did you hear from the Prime Minister, and did it meet your needs in terms of what you wanted to hear from the Prime Minister, especially on energy policy?
Well, we're very hopeful. I mean, I know that the Prime Minister realized he had to pivot when he got elected. He eliminated the carbon tax, the retail carbon tax, immediately. He's had a look at the net zero vehicle mandate, and he's paused that and delayed the implementation, I think realizing it's unworkable. So I think he's demonstrated that he's pragmatic, and so we've been making the case about why it is the remaining bad laws need to be addressed if we're going to restore the private sector investment climate to be able to attract big dollars back so that we can get pipelines built. So we've got a three-part proposal, address those 9 bad laws. Let's build a bitumen pipeline to the BC coast, and let's build the Pathways project to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. And I think that we'd be able to get a deal that works not only for Alberta, but for Canada as well.
So what kind of, I mean, look, a pipeline is a bit more further down the road, but in terms of some of these other issues you're talking about, what's the timeline that we might expect something more firm?
I think they have to all come together. I mean, there has to be a meeting of the minds so that we know that if we have a big, expensive project like Pathways, which could be $10 to $20 billion, that there's a new source of revenue from it, which you would get from a million barrel a day bitumen pipeline that would generate about $20 billion a year in revenues, of which governments get about 40%. But in order to be able to fill that pipeline, we need to eliminate the tanker ban off the West Coast. We need to eliminate the emissions cap. We need to eliminate the greenwashing bill that punishes companies for talking about their environmental records. So there's a few things that are preconditions to being able to get anything built, and those are the things that we're talking about.
Okay, I do want to talk about that pipeline proposal where Alberta is now acting as a proponent for a pipeline route to the BC coast. You've said that the Prime Minister needs to show some courage and some leadership. So tell me what that's going to look like in reality, in practice. What do you need to see in terms of a signal right now from the federal government that they might be interested?
Well, what we'd like to see it is having it on the major projects list. We know that the initial major projects list that was put out had some projects that were at a pretty advanced stage, but the Prime Minister has signaled that he wants to do an additional list by Grey Cup, and we have two projects we'd like to see on it, the bitumen pipeline as well as the Pathways project. And so that's what we're working towards. I think having an announcement like that would demonstrate that the Prime Minister has heard and is concerned about Alberta's interests and willing to address them. And so that's we've got a few weeks to see if he's going to move in that direction, and we hope he does.
Okay, but as you know, of course, the BC coastal tanker ban is a big part of this question of a pipeline. The federal energy minister calls it a hypothetical question right now in terms of removing that ban because there is no official proposal before the federal government. Do you expect that the federal government will go ahead and ultimately revoke that ban?
Well, I can tell you we've got all of the most skilled pipeline companies at the table as our technical advisor. I think between all of the people at the table, I think they've got a collective 550 years of experience in building pipelines. Enbridge, Southbow, which is the former TC Energy oil assets, as well as Trans Mountain, which has some experience in building to the BC coast. So I think people see the opportunity of opening up new markets. And when you think about where the new markets are, for our product, it makes sense to be Asia. With the opening of the Trans Mountain pipeline, we've already seen that half of the product is going to Asia, not just China, but also Korea. They've now committed to buying 1 million barrels a month, and we hear that they want more. So that if we're serious about this exercise of trying to diversify our markets, because we've become too reliant on the U.S., that really is the only option for us and the best option, which is why we've chosen to partner with a technical advisory committee to advance it, start the work with Indigenous consultation so that we can have an Indigenous equity stake and hopefully get a yes from the Prime Minister.
Okay, I do want to ask about the BC element of this because the BC Premier is again criticizing your pipeline plan. He's calling it fictional, he's calling it fantasy, and right now I do want to show you part of what David Eby had to say on social media yesterday.
Doesn't have First Nations consent, makes no financial or economic sense. It has no private proponent, no route, no private funding, and would cost taxpayers billions. The non-existent Alberta pipeline project would put tens of billions of dollars in real BC projects and jobs at risk.
So we have the BC Premier saying, look, I'm going to stand up and defend my province's economy, my province's job, my province's major projects against the threat that a pipeline poses, and he also talked about the environmental aspect as well. Earlier today, you called those comments un-Canadian and unconstitutional. Why is what he said un-Canadian and unconstitutional?
Well, they're bold. I'll say why they're un-Canadian is because we all have agreed at various tables that we're going to support each other, to do more trade with each other and to open new markets together. We agreed at both of our tables to work on an economic corridor between Prince Rupert and Churchill, and it wasn't everything gets to go in here except the products that Alberta produces. It's we're going to support you and you support us. So I think that there's a little bit of grandstanding going on there, and it's unconstitutional because it's not his authority to make these decisions. That's been very clearly defined by the court. The reason why trade and commerce power has been given to the federal government and ports as well and interprovincial pipelines is because we can't allow the parochial interests of a single premier to stop the major projects that need to be developed for the benefit of the country. And so we are also not at all interested in seeing a project of this magnitude built with taxpayer money. I think that would be a failure of what it is we're trying to do. We have lost about, our estimate, $500 billion in private capital because of the bad laws that have been in place for the last 10 years. If we correct those bad laws, we'll attract that private capital back. That's what we're aiming to do. And I think you can see from his reaction the precise reason why we needed to step forward, because that vitriol would have been targeted at a particular company, and we want to make sure that we can get it to a point where we have private capital knowing that it's going to get built so that we can get it to the finish line. So we're prepared to take that forward to get to that point.
Okay, we only have a moment left, and I want to ask you about what you were saying yesterday in Montreal, because you called this a moment of reckoning for Canada's economy. You said the country is in grave danger and that Canadians need to support each other to survive as a country. That's pretty strong language. Why do you think that kind of language is warranted right now?
Well, because when you look at what we've seen for the last 10 years, where we've been printing money and going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, every single government is in dire financial straits, including ours. We've got billion-dollar deficits also. You cannot be in a position where you're reliant on a single trade partner and the relationship becomes unreliable, and you don't look for new partners. You have to start looking for new markets. The only way that you can support and sustain government spending is that you've got to create the wealth before you spend it. And so we haven't been doing that for the past 10 years. And now we've got to, whether it's LNG export, whether it's new pipelines so we can do bitumen export, whether it's uranium development or copper and gold mine development or interties, those are the things that we're talking about now. And I think that's a good change of pace. So when I go abroad, I support all of my premiers and all of the various products that Canada produces. And I think that that's the spirit that Canadians want to see us working in, and I hope all of the premiers take that message.
All right, we'll leave it there. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, appreciate your time as always.
You bet, thank you.
Time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. Today is the 2-year anniversary of the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. Some 1,200 people were killed, including several Canadians. MPs were marking this solemn day on Parliament Hill with tributes to those lost.
Alex was also a proud Jew. On October 7th, 2023, he was vacationing in Israel, attending a music festival, when dozens of armed Hamas terrorists attacked. He calmed people down and stood at the door of a shelter blocking the terrorists. He died a hero, saving the lives of others.
Ben, Vivian, Judy, Adi, Alexandra, Netta, Shir, Tiferet. May their memories be a blessing. May we remember the source of both pain and joy is love.
And 2 organizers of the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests were sentenced in Ottawa today. Tamara Leach and Chris Barber were both spared additional prison time. Instead, a judge gave out 18-month conditional sentences, including 12 months of house arrest and 100 hours of community service. Leach and Barber were both found guilty of mischief charges earlier this year. And that is all for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Andrew Thompson. For Michael Serapio and all of us at CPAC, thanks for watching and have a great evening. We'll see you next time.